Hi, and welcome to Curation Conversations. This is a podcast by Multilocal where we'll be meeting industry experts from across the world in order to talk to them about curation and how it's impacting their business. Today, I'm joined by James Harris. He runs strategy and planning at WPP across multiple brands. I'm really excited to have him on the show as we're going to be talking about how curation is actually working for brands and for strategy, as opposed to it just being about ad tech. Thank you, James. Very much enjoyed the cocktail, but let's get into it. Let's talk about curation. Now, there's a lot of conversations happening around curation. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of people trying to define it in the industry. And what I'm really excited about is actually hearing your view of how you would look to curation to help solve some of the things for your clients and just, the curation through your lens that's not just a lot of ad tech conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think there's too much time being spent on people discussing what is curation. I mean, you only have to spend a happy hour on LinkedIn and it's just, it's full of that sort of bullshit, for want of a better word, of people going, I think it's this. I think the definition is actually pretty straightforward, right? I mean, if you go and you look in the English dictionary, you can find out what curation means. You can then take that into a business context. It's really about using data and information to help people find what they're looking for. And I think if we all get over ourselves and go, that's what we're doing, then let's spend our time thinking about why it's important, right? I think the other problem is people are spending so much time going, here's the wiring diagrams, here's the what, the how, which I get why they do it, but they're not actually talking about why it's important. And I think, especially when you think about brands, you think about advertisers who don't love a good wiring diagram, they don't love a hell on earth through PowerPoint. That's important, right? You need to be able to say to someone why this is a good idea. So I think for me, let's stop trying to define it. Let's stop trying to have that debate. Let's get into why this is a good thing. And then, we easily get to the how and the what from there.
That makes sense. So you touched upon a really good point there where, like you said, it's not about the definition, but the value it can actually bring to brands. Like, how are you working with brands to understand how curation can help kind of influence their strategy, or how are you advising them in your role?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you go back to the early days of programmatic, right, and I am old enough, I know I don't look it, but I am old enough and don't laugh at me. We came out with this great promise, right, that it would change the world, it would save the world, it would all be about great stories to consumers. And then, of course, what happens is we went, well, actually, there's other things we can do here, not least, it's about pilot high, buy it cheap. And I think, curation is a fix to some of those problems that we created. But I think it is about the audiences. It's about the ability to connect the audience data we have into what we actually put in front of them. I think there's a disconnect. And I think from my perspective and the job I do, it's really about how, media and creative can come back together. Because I think the danger is we do great media planning, we do great targeting, but then we don't really care about what we show people. Yeah. And I think the evidence would be, well, it's kind of important what we show people. So I think curation can help us reconnect that. And it also brings, less is more, I think is a really important thought. We don't need too much technology. We don't need, points of failure. I think at the moment, the current system's got way too much friction in it, and it just kind of falls down quite badly.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, isn't it? Where the fact that actually the technology itself is creating the friction that's actually almost kind of providing a barrier to entry for brands to go, well, actually, if I need to invest in the open web, if I want to find audiences, like you said, with the right message, right time, how do I do that in such a complex and fragmented environment where it's easy on other platforms to do? So we're almost programmatic's created a problem for itself by not being easy to understand and easy to find audiences and easy to talk to them. Do you see curation being able to help with that?
I think so. I think we've created a lot of our own problems. I mean, I think, we worked together a few years back, and I apologise for that. But at the time, you remember when I was talking to brands, we came out with that lovely thought of, programmatic to programmagic, right? I mean, a little bit Harry Potter-ish, but it was a shout out to brands to say, hey, look, this should be about storytelling, right? This should be about, telling your brand story to consumers. And I think curation is an attempt to try and get back to that. And I think if we do embrace it as such, it'll work. My worry is we get into all this bullshit bingo. I mean, my cocktail, which I still think was a 5, by the way, right? I called it.
We can argue this.
Yeah, I called it the Emperor's New Ad Tech because. Well, absolutely. But Emperor's New Ad Tech, that's the problem, right? There is a lot of Emperor's New clothes out there. There is a lot of people saying, it's this, it's that. We all do curation. We all do AI curation. And I think that's the danger. And that's a danger we've had with the industry for years. So I think that's the risk we're running. But if we take it as it's intended, we make it simple, it's a way for us to fix a lot of those problems.
Thank you. I think that's really insightful. And you've talked a lot and mentioned it a few times about the storytelling and how integral that is to brands, because they want, I guess, outcomes, and they want reassurance that where they're investing that next dollar is the right place. So with that in mind, how do you, and say that's from a strategic perspective, from a planning perspective, like how do you fix that delta that has kind of appeared between, planning an audience, like finding them, and then being able to execute on that in programmatic as well, where it just seems to be about like a tech or a bid stream or any other, all those terminology. You need a whole glossary to kind of navigate your way through, I guess, as a brand.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of sums the problem up, right? Which is when you get into that and you start, talking to audience planners and you start saying things like bid streams, it doesn't mean anything to them. They don't actually care. They don't really understand what you're saying. So, I think it's maybe it's utopian, right? But it's if we can really understand deep audiences in a deep, rich way, being able to then activate that easily into what we're doing. And for me, it's not just about what I would call traditional digital formats. It's about taking that into CTV or taking it into, digital out of home. That really has to be the ambition, right? That all media is digital. I mean, it's delivered digitally pretty much, right? Yeah. So if we can take that thought and play with it, I think we get to a really interesting place where it does become about storytelling. It becomes about, again, the word curation, right? It's curating the right information, the right story to the right person at the right time. I think we've kind of forgotten the right story in the right format a little bit, and oh, you're my audience, I'll now hit you with something. And, that's what I think curation solves for.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? We find focus so much on the technology to deliver the impression, forgotten the value of that impression, which is actually a person. It's like that bridging that audience between the brand and the content owner. Yeah,
I mean, my kind of old cliches, right? But like, you don't buy a car and drive it onto the forecourt and then start stripping it apart. But I mean, this is the problem, right? People do this. And, I'm seeing a lot on LinkedIn at the moment, people going, right, I'm going to take the car apart in front of everybody here. And it's kind of totally unnecessary. I mean, why are we doing that? So again, I think especially when you get to clients and brands, they want it simple.
Yeah.
And I think you made a very good point in something you commented on recently, which is let's spend the time on the why, right? Why is this a good idea? If you can answer that, the how and the what is pretty defined. In anything, any strategy I do, we always go for the why. And then once you've got that, the rest is pretty easy.
That makes sense. And then when you're talking to your clients about the why, do you see that there's like an opportunity, whether it's through curation, whether it's through programmatic, like the ability for brands to kind of control the data, control their audiences, and be able to monetize that better using these pipes? Like, does curation and this evolution of programmatic enable the brand to take more control?
I think so. I mean, there's an interesting thought that I think some brands actually don't realize they can monetize their data well, and actually that it's a revenue stream. And again, there's always a trade-off with consumers, right? So I think you always have to go, what's the value exchange? And I think if you get into some of the social platforms, they've slightly overstepped that line in the past, and consumers have gone, my God, actually the value exchange is not balanced. But if you look at other brands, of course there's a value exchange, and consumers are not stupid, they know that. So I think there is an opportunity there, and therefore it becomes a revenue stream that can be pumped back into their advertising, their media. So I think there's a big opportunity around the actual data engines as well. And I sometimes refer to it as zero-party data, but there's clients sitting on stacks of brilliant data that's their data and not necessarily going, we can use this or monetize it.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? There's almost like curation can help kind of break down those barriers to entry for brands to monetize their own data. But for their users, quite importantly, as you say, you've got to bring it back to the fact that people, there's individuals involved here, they're seeing the ads, that these brands can then control their users' experience. So in a world where we're looking at being, the consent first internet, where we're talking about creative experience, that's not lost because a brand can kind of control its own destiny with their individual people that's using.
Yeah, and the problem is, sometimes we sort of try and talk to ourselves, impress ourselves, right? And what I mean by that is it's all about the technology, it's all about the ad tech and, sod the consumer, right? It doesn't really matter. I'll give you an example, and you've probably heard this one before, right? But years ago, I bought one of these lovely memory foam mattresses. Great. Super product, right? Really happy with it until the point I bought it, and then I just got bombarded with adverts for more mattresses. Now, I know I may look like a princess, but I'm not, right? I don't need a whole stack of damn things with a P underneath it. But that, for me, speaks to the problem. It's we don't think enough about the consumer, right? I mean, if they'd said to me, would you like a pillow? Or, thank you for buying this. I mean, I sometimes describe it as the joy of not being sold anything. Yeah. There is a lot we can do. And I think curation actually offers an opportunity for us, the clue's in the word, right? But to curate that to the consumer. Yeah. And then you'll get a lot more positivity. But I think the problem is, if we try and take the old methods we applied and keep pushing them forward, we're always trying to sell people things, and people don't always want to be buying something.
Yeah, to buy. There's an interesting point, I think, within that, that conversation and your response, that people don't always want to be sold to, but they are always passively consuming the internet, right? And you've got this healthy tension, I think, that exists between what we classify as walled gardens and the open web. Yeah. And curation is being born out of the open web, because what we're trying to do is establish how do we attract more advertising dollar to this rich tapestry of what you could say was, content, it's influencers, it's really diverse, and therefore gains competitive advantage for brands to advertise in, unlike maybe some of the cookie cutter approaches that you'll experience in a walled garden. Yeah. But what's the reality for brands to be able to do so? Is that something you can see moving forwards? Will that evolve? Is there an opportunity for divestment into the open web? I
think so. I think it very much depends, I think, on your view on the open web, right? I mean, I'm probably less utopian than you in terms of, I'm old enough as well. I mean, I work for AOL, for God's sake, right? That shows how old I am. But AOL was the traditional walled garden. But I think it's really interesting because I think there's a utopian view and there's a reality. And the reality is I don't think you're ever going to have a purely open web. I mean, at the end of the day, people are in business to make money. So there's always going to be some limitations. That said, I think there is a world where you can exist with the two, right? You can have the big players, you can have the walled gardens, but you can also have the niche offerings. If you go back, 25 years, right, when we were first playing around with the internet and doing the first internet advertising, that was kind of how we operated. We had the big walled gardens, but then we would go and work with niche sites. Yeah. So I think for me, it's probably just being a bit more of a realist. I mean, I get the whole kind of open web dream, right? But it's the same as the blockchain dream. And I'm a big blockchain guy. But, yes, get rid of the banks, get rid of the institutions. It's kind of never going to happen, right? And so I think to some degree, you've got to go, how do we connect the two? But I think the two can connect if you take that view on it.
That makes sense. And with that comes this, there's a recent announcement that's happened around Meta, and I just wanted to get the view from you whilst we're sat here having this conversation, because it relates to the fact that how do we try and drive this divestiture, as you said, whether that's utopian and whether that's a reality. I think there's a lot of work to be done by people that represent the open web to make it easy. But the recent announcement by Meta that they're moving into principal media buying, does that further kind of create more barriers? Does that further disable those kind of conversations because it's quite attractive for brands to move into principal media buying?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is principal media buying is not necessarily a negative, right? I think there's a danger that people go, oh my God, it's a bad thing. It's it's people making money, etc. It's been around for a long time and it exists in all media. It's not a negative, right? So actually, there's a benefit to clients of that method. I think from Meta's point of view, it's just reflective of their place in the market. They're a big player, right? But they're no longer the player that everybody wants to work with. They have to work to earn those dollars. So I think, for me, it's an obvious thing for them to do because it's a natural evolution. But, 5 years ago, you probably got fired for not putting Meta on a schedule. Now, sometimes you probably have to justify it.
Yeah.
And, that's not to say it's a bad buy, but I think that's just a bit more balance in the system. So I think they're just playing catch up with other, this goes on in other media. It's gone on in other medias for years. And as I say, it actually brings value to clients if it's done in a proper way. So it doesn't surprise me, but yeah, I can imagine, the utopian purists are a little bit kind of, oh my God, what's going on?
What's happening? You mentioned a good point I want to ask you there, like about, you have a Meta on a media plan. Like planning is curation, right? And actually, how would you get curation to show up on that plan? Is it about really breaking down where the advertiser dollar's going? Is it about audiences? What does that plan look like?
I think it's probably audience-based. I think the danger is we fixate, again, to go back to Exhibit A, we fixate too much on going, what's curation? And sort of going, it's this thing we've got to put in its own little bucket. So I think curation probably works best when it's just a thing that's there, right? We don't necessarily call it out as a separate line item. I think that's the danger, right? We put it in its own little thing. But you're right. I think, the media agencies were born from curation, right? The reason media agencies became a thing was people wanted to curate all these media channels into one thing. And I still think that, that role is immensely powerful. I think, yes, agencies are evolving, and I think AI is also a catalyst, right, to change how we do that. But I do think there is a massive role for agencies. And I think, it goes back to your principal buying question. Yeah. That's one of the reasons that works, because it takes the pain away from clients of having to do all of these things together. Agencies can curate it. So I think, curation becomes a mechanism, a tactic in it. And as I say, if you then start to think of curation across all channels, then actually I think it becomes a super powerful thing. I think, it's probably not there at the moment, but that should be the aspiration, for brands, for advertisers, for people like yourselves, I guess, to move to that as a mechanism.
That makes sense. So you're very much and firmly in the camp of agencies are doing curation. It's not something that should be left to, say, a DSP?
Oh, God, no. I can see how that could go badly wrong. I mean, look, I know there will be people out there who say that, right? I mean, but again, reality versus utopia, right? Programmatic was supposed to decentralized media, right? It was I think the phrase was democratize media, move it away from the big players. I probably was one of the people who stood there at the time and said, this will give us more power against, X, Y, Z. It hasn't happened, and I don't think it necessarily will happen either. So I think there's a really important role for agencies. That said, I do think more flexibility is needed. I think the speed of change, the speed of evolution is the thing now that's frightening. And I'm not going to get into the AI thing because I've said the bloody word now, but you get my point. I was going to say,
I mean, you could dive in. This is we're here for you.
Well, the speed that is changing things is pretty terrifying, and I think before AI, maybe it would be 6 months, right? And if you change something every 2 weeks, great. Now, pretty much every day, and therefore I think that's going to be the interesting question: is how does that technology crash into it, and how do we use that in an effective way? I mean, we're already looking at that in lots of different ways, but again, it brings back creative media and production become a really interesting question.
Yeah, being able to bridge that kind of full closed loop experience enables a brand actually to probably get more insight as well as to what's working. Where we've disintermediated media and creative, what we've got now is a bit of a gap where the two kind of sides of performance aren't talking to each other. And when I say performance, I don't mean like brand budget and performance budget. It's just like the reality of how a consumer's engaging with the advertiser.
Yeah, and if you put production in there, then there's a huge benefit for clients. I mean, selfishly, that's one of the things we can do, right? Yeah. We can do media, we can do creative, we can do production. So we're in a very good position to take advantage of that. And, we are working at pace to evolve that for clients. I think it gives us a competitive advantage, but we have to be able to work with the right partners, the people to evolve that and to evolve that really, really quickly.
I love that. And I think there's one thing, there's this kind of, there's this shift, I feel, in the industry of maybe born out of the fact that ad tech is really noisy, but I feel like what brands need and want is quite consistent, whether it's growth, whether it's outcomes, whether it's finding their next consumer. So how do you find the best partners to work with? for each, and every brand you work with, I know, is going to be different. But like, how do you navigate all of that, say, Loomascape, to find the right partners that actually fit the brief?
Because I mean, it is a lot more complicated than it used to be. I mean, 30 years ago, we kind of had 2-3 TV channels, a few newspapers, and this thing called the internet started appearing. So you're right. It
sounds like good times.
It was fantastic. I spend most of my time in bars, which is why I'm so comfortable behind the bar. Yeah,
I see it now.
I mean, I'd love to go back to that, to be honest. So maybe we should just unplug the internet. But if we can't do this, I think again, there's a really interesting thing in this, which is all about the human element of trust. And I think actually you're right, it hasn't changed, right? People want to work with people that they trust. They want to work with people who understand their business. And I think, it's interesting. We need to go back to that. We need to again think about the consumer, because the consumers, yes, they've changed massively, but people still buy stuff. They still want to, they still want to, I don't know, buy a chocolate bar last weekend for Easter. So I think ultimately there's still a bunch of drivers in there. I mean, I find it fascinating that if you look at the wisdoms of David Ogilvy, they're still brilliant wisdoms, right? And they're actually probably the sharpest ones you can get out there. So look at those and go, yeah, that's relevant. That tells you everything you need to know. So I think in this world of technology and complexity, it's trust and it's also simplicity.
Yeah.
So, I see so many people who go, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And then they hit me with a 200-page PowerPoint deck that makes me want to lose the will to live, right? But that's the problem.
I'm sure you love it.
Well, no, but this is really important, because if you turn up to people and you say curation is going to make it easier, it's going to make it simpler, and then you prove the opposite with how you sell it. I mean, credit where credit's due for. And one of the things I like about you is your ability to explain it without any slides. Now, some people go, oh my God, no slides. But if you can do that, it's because you understand it. And I think, we need a bit more of that in the industry, because, as I say, when you go on LinkedIn now, you're just seeing this. I mean, my God, it's slightly horrific. I won't quote some of the things I've seen lately, but it sort of does make me kind of get a bit angry.
Fair enough. In terms of like next steps, where do you see curation going? Like in your business, through your lens, or, through your role, like where you're sat, just what's the next real kind of important conversation that you want to have around curation?
I think it's creative coming into it, right? I think it's, where we have the ability, as I say, to bring creative in there and production. I think it's also about multi-channel, if that's the right thing to say. It's not just about what I would call narrowband digital. I think that's a danger. We just go, oh, it's programmatic, so we limit it to that. We should be able to put this into all channels, because all channels are digital in delivery. So I think for me, those two things, if we can crack it, we have a very different model. Yeah. And I think in there's some radical thoughts, right? I mean, even things like, we go, well, how does it work with the DSP? Well, why not go, do we need a DSP? I mean, I think it's that level of thinking is going to be very important. And I think, it also moves us away from a model of what I call manpower driven, which is, lots of hands on keyboards, to more kind of thinking power. Yeah. So again, I think that's where AI comes into it. Mm-hmm. Fewer, smarter people solving the problems, thinking ahead. Yeah. I think we'll push it to where it can go. Then it doesn't just become the, oh my God, it was a good idea at the time, and then I don't know, we come up with another word in 3 years, which is the danger, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've alluded to that with your AdTech Emperor's New Clothes, that there's always these kind of iterations, and we go through multiple cycles of reinventing something perhaps that...
you remember the DMP, yeah? I mean, good God, yes, those things. But
roll them out.
Everyone had to have a DMP.
Yeah.
Can't even name any of them now, right? So, but it does show you that's the danger that we face as an industry. We get overexcited on the technicalities. We've done something really clever, and clever should always be effective.
Makes sense.
You take Bunsen and Beaker from the Muppets, right? Two of my heroes, but. They used to do lots of clever stuff, but none of it was ever effective. So, joking aside, that's the problem. We always need to go, is this going to be effective? If it is, great, then push on with it.
Solid advice to close with, I feel, that just make sure you're effective, keep it simple. Anything else you'd add to that?
No, I mean, you remember I once did a whole programmatic presentation with Muppets.
You did, James? It was enlightening. I think actually you should resurrect that.
You know what, I might dig that one out.
I think you should.
It probably could be a good thing to do.
I'd love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation. I really appreciate your insights and just everything that you've brought to Curation that's just beyond, as you said, the ad tech noise, like what we can actually be doing to make a difference for clients and brands and, working with agencies such as WPP.
Yep, thank you for having me.